Hello there, Steven Teles.
How you doing, Glenn?
I'm doing all right. Welcome to the Glenn Show, Steve. Why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Steve Teles. I'm a associate professor of political science at Johns Hopkins, and I've been a while since I've done one of these. I think I was blackballed by by Blogging Head Central, but I apparently am back in due to your good graces. So
I didn't confer with Blogging Head Central before I invited you on, Steve. Maybe I should have done so. What did you do? What did you do to offend our betters?
I have no idea. I talked to Jim Pinkerton, which may have been violation enough. So.
Oh, no, Jim's always fun. I don't see why anyone should object to you talking to him. We don't have to agree with what he says.
So in that case, he was probably talking to you.
All right, then. Well, welcome to the Glenn Show, Steve, political scientist extraordinaire in my book, and author of a couple of pieces recently that are very stimulating, and I wanted to talk with you about. One having to do with all of this that we're reading and hearing about these days concerning policy change and reform in the area of incarceration. Too many Americans in prison. It's too costly. It's not working. Policy's off the tracks. A lot of people are recognizing that. We see op-eds all over the place. And you and your young colleague, student, I gather, at Hopkins, have produced an essay. You can tell us about it, in which you explore the politics of prison policy reform from an interesting point of view, thinking that, for example, conservatives have a major role to play in that process. And I wanted to talk with you about that. And if I can just set the agenda and then we go forward. The other essay of yours that I saw recently at the New America Foundation website, which is very interesting indeed, analyzes and criticizes the increasing complexity of American policymaking process and what you call kludgeocracy, and goes into the reasons why, the negative consequences thereof, and possibilities for reform in that area. And I also wanted to discuss that with you.
Right, and then finally, I think I've talked you into finally giving up your opinions on Django Unchained if we have time there at the end.
If we get to it, we may do a little movie criticism, and you'll see if you've actually changed my mind or not. But you have made me think. So, why don't you just give us a brief précis of the argument that you're making with Dagan? Is that his name?
Yes. So David Dagan is my student. He actually was my student back at when I used to teach at Brandeis as an undergrad. So I've been working with this guy for a long time. He went out and was a journalist for a while, and I think that shows in the article. Again, this piece was at least as much David's as mine, so I should make that clear. So the background of the piece, I think, again, the theoretical background, is that I'm interested in the question of how people change their mind, which is obviously something that's a subject near and dear to your heart, too.
It is indeed.
And why is it that not just individuals, but entire political movements change what their positions are, right? I mean, as political scientists, we're pretty good at saying, well, let's assume that we've got two groups or two parties, and they both got positions, and we're going to game out based on what voters are doing or whatever it is, where the final policy outcome is. But there's a separate question, which is how do movements decide what their position is in the first place, right? Where they are on abortion, where they are on crime or gun control or any of these other things. And these actually do change over time, right? It's not just a matter of who wins or who loses that matters. It's how movements decide what winning or losing amounts to.
Okay, hold on. Steve, let me slow you down a little bit, because at least I am not sufficiently steeped in the political science lore to be able to keep up with all this moving stuff. Okay, so we've got movements. I just want to clarify what the elements of the analysis. We've got movements. Movements then have somehow collectively or corporately to come to some understanding of what their purposes are, what they believe in, what their stand is, what's their position. And then once we have some understanding both of the movements and of their formulation of their view, we can then entertain questions about how their views might change, all of this being critical to understanding the process of policy reform and policy change. Am I getting this?
Right. Yes, and so these movements are also obviously connected to elected officials, right? These elected officials are both affiliated, in some cases consider themselves to be members of that larger social movement, right? So one way to think about the Republican Party is it's a movement party, right? In large part, the conservative movement has been entirely incorporated into the Republican Party, and so position change among conservative activists is also deeply connected to position change among elected officials, right? So then the question is, how do or why do these movements and their affiliated elected officials switch positions that they once held very strongly and choose to move to a different position, right? That's I think the generic question, which is underneath the question of how conservatives are starting to change their positions on incarceration.
And the idea here, or one idea may be that whatever it is that gives the movement its impetus, that gets people out of their chairs, gets them to open their wallets, that gives it its energy and its sense of purpose, can't be compromised or undermined by any changes that the evidence and the facts as they come in might seem to indicate. The change has to be in some way or another consistent with maintaining the movement's self-understanding and all that kind of stuff.
Right. So there's two dimensions that are worth laying out here in the beginning, right? One is there's an excellent book by David Carroll, who's now at University of Maryland, called Party Position Change, which is, about what you would think it would be about. And David makes a distinction there between two kinds of issues, right? One are party positions that are anchored by a large organized group, right? So the Republican Party has the position it has on abortion because pro-lifers are a major constitutive coalition member, right? And so if the Republican Party tried to change its position on abortion, those pro-life activists would get up and say, screw you, you can't do that, right? We're going to walk, right? That's one kind of anchoring. The other are opportunistic positions, right? Or what I think Carroll calls groupless positions, right? So the crime or prison position, it wasn't exactly like there was a big organized group in the Republican Party who were going to walk out if the Republican Party changed their position. The reason the Republican Party had that position is it worked, right? It was an opportunistic position that in large part was held not for coalitional reasons, but for electoral advantage, and to some degree was anchored by affect, right? By who members of the party thought were people who deserved honor and who didn't, right? But again, there's no organized group who was there saying, if we change our position, we're gonna walk out, right? Again,
okay, hold on just a minute. I want to be clear what position we're talking about here. Policing, prisons, exactly what is the position that you're as opportunistic on behalf of the Republicans here?
Right. So in this, basically the position is mass incarceration, right? The position is the idea that the best way to respond to crime is to build more prisons, to build tougher prisons, and that was the position of the Republican Party really starting in the 1970s and going until very recently, right? There's a bunch of allied kind of positions you can think of as part of that larger tough on crime nexus, but that's the one we're talking about in this article, right? It's basically the idea that prisons are good, prisons work, and we got to build more of them and lock people away.
Okay, and you're saying there is no discrete constituency that's going to walk from the party if the party doesn't take a particular position on those issues. Rather, the party has come to a position on those issues because they have come to the belief that it's worked well, and because the position that they have is consonant with other kind of ideological or value orientations characteristic of the party.
Right. And again, I think the important thing to note, and again, this is what actually gives positions some degree of instability, is what political scientists call dimensionality, which is on any particular position, you have to figure out, well, what is this actually about, right? What are the various different commitments that we have is actually at stake here, right? And so for a long time in prisons, I think that the underlying dimension of the issue that was salient for Republican officials was that criminals were bad, and the people on the other side, the people who were the forces of order, right? In this case, prison officials, wardens, more broadly, police, right? They were good. They were good, and criminals were bad, and we were in favor of whatever the people who we felt a strong sort of affiliation or identity with was, right? And again, you can think about a similar dimension is involved in defense, right? The Republicans generally thought of generals and soldiers as their people, and that sort of identity dimension of the issue was what dominated. Now, of course, there was a kind of hidden dimension to that issue that wasn't being acted upon, which is that Republicans also believe in limited government, and they have all kind of public choice beliefs about about the problems with government, the fact that government is self-interested, that it's inefficient, that it has a tendency to expand of its own power. But all of that dimension of the issue of incarceration was essentially hidden by this dominant identity and also, I think, arguably racial dimension of the issue.
Yeah. But hold on, let me just ask you a question, especially stimulated by the observation about race, which is the Republican Party has become much more a Southern party in the last two generations, and there are very stark regional differences in policy practice and attitudes toward prisons, law enforcement, and so forth. I happen to be sitting in the state of Texas right now, and I'm mindful of those regional differences. And I'm just wondering whether that's another factor that's at play here in the party's tough on crime, hard line stance in the law enforcement area, which is namely that simply sits much better with the base of the party, which is now largely in the South and the Southwest.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little hard in some ways to square with the data, right, in the sense that Republican officials everywhere pursued this line, right? I mean, California was certainly, was a leader in three strikes and you're out, in building prisons. In some ways, California has been less aggressive at rethinking mass incarceration than Texas has. So if I was just trying to line up who's been rethinking mass incarceration and doing the most about it, it's not clear that there's any pattern like that. The thing that I think actually is really salient, and the other thing that again that anchors positions, is when they're working electorally. So the important point to note for Republicans is that for a long time they kept trying to keep getting to the right of where the Democrats were, right? But at some point, really starting in the early 2000s and even earlier with Clinton and passing the crime bill in his early administration, Democrats pretty much moved all the way to where the Republicans were. And this is a way of thinking about how issue positions can be self-liquidating, right? That is, you can sort of lose by winning. That is, if you're so successful at playing a particular issue, then you're going to pull the other side all the way over to you, at which point there's no political advantage in the issue anymore.
Well, not anymore, but you haven't lost in the sense that along the way you will have accumulated political advantage by having been there first, no?
Yeah, but you would have gotten that. There would have been a brand advantage. But at some point, if you can no longer run political ads against the other side saying, this guy voted against whatever it is, then it's not real clear why you would keep playing that issue as opposed to playing another issue. And so I think one thing that's really in the background of all of this change is that the electoral salience of crime has declined, right? And that's largely declined because
crime has declined.
Republicans so thoroughly routed the Democrats on that.
Oh, I see. But let me ask you this now, because you were headed toward this, and I think this is something you're going to want to develop in your argument. So on the one hand, conservatives are tough on crime and pro-imprisonment, pro-police. On the other hand, however, the core ideology of the Conservative Party is against big government and suspicious of government power. Now, if 2.5 million or 2.25 million people in prison and 5 million people under correctional supervision and an escalating budget for incarceration and control and the proliferation of prisons and imprisonment are not big government putting its hands on people, I don't know what is. So there would appear to be built in the cake here of the conservative ideology a kind of contradiction. And a question would arise then as to why that contradiction hasn't been more explicitly expressed in the intra-party deliberations on this issue.
Right. So this is, I mean, somewhat in the Washington Monthly article that you referred to, and more in the academic version of this, we talk about the phenomenon of sort of selective perception, right? That is, if you've got negative feedback coming out of some policy, right? Like, you know, I mean, you have lots of reoffending, right? Or you simply have huge amounts of budget that's going to a particular area, right? Why is it that Republicans didn't pay attention to that before? And again, I think part of it is people have a tendency to ignore evidence that contradicts their own self-interest. And if your self-interest is in continuing to use this issue to win elections, you're going to ignore a lot of facts along those lines. The second, again, I think, is identity, right? You're going to generally tend to ignore evidence that people who you consider to be your allies or you consider to be honorable people are doing things that are dishonorable or at least inefficient. That's going to be identity inappropriate. And so in general, and this is we draw on the work of Dan Kahan at Yale Law School, to say that basically people process information through identity, right? They pay attention to information that's consistent with what they perceive their identity to be, and they selectively ignore evidence that is the kind of thing that the other side believes. And so I think for a long time, you've had that, and that's one of the things that anchored this position, is this process of selective information processing. And so the question is, what created that shift from the point where Republicans were completely ignoring all of the pathological consequences of mass incarceration to the point where they suddenly seem open to attending to all those costs that you talked about. And again, I think part of it is the point about declining electoral salience. I think the second part is the increasing libertarianism of the Republican Party, right? You have a lot of people who are in the party, especially state legislators, who tend to turn over fairly rapidly, who weren't there when we passed three strikes laws, who don't have a lot of inherited reputational capital associated with those issues, and whose libertarianism is a lot more deep-seated. So I think that's part of it. And the third part is this, which I think a lot of this paper is about identity vouching, right? That is, people generally tend to hold a particular position and select out information until those who are really the people who hold on to the brand of the party or the movement tell them that it's okay to pay attention to new information, right? And so one thing that's happened over the last few years is really major Republican officials, people like Ed Meese, Bill Bennett, all these people who are involved in what's known as the Right on Crime Coalition, have come out and basically opened up space for Republicans to say, you can be a badass Republican conservative and pay attention to this information, right? Paying attention to this information will no longer be a threat to your identity and make people think that you're a closet softy, right? And especially in a highly polarized environment, people have a real primary attachment not to neutral processing of information in a scientific way, but they have a primary attachment to their own ideological identity. And I think that's one of the really big things when you combine all those factors. And the final one, again, in some of these states is that the Republican Party controls everything, right? If you look at Texas, they control the governorship, both state legislatures, and state branches of state legislature. And one thing that means is they're in control of everything anymore, right? And therefore, they've got a kind of complete responsibility for this issue that they didn't when they were under divided government. And so one thing I think this suggests is actually there's a greater degree of responsibility when you're when you're in charge of everything and when you no longer have to worry about getting reelected anymore.
Yeah, this is interesting, Steve. And one thing that it seems to underscore is that not only in a state like Texas, where the Republicans are literally in charge, on this issue, it seems you and your student colleague are arguing Republicans really are in the driver's seat in terms of the political discourse and policy reform process because liberals and Democrats are so vulnerable and have been so scarred historically by the soft on crime critique that comes from the right, that they can't possibly be, it's almost a kind of Nixon going to China phenomenon. Republicans are going to have to be the ones to push on this issue. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, and I think even more than that, the Republicans actually have more room to move the less that that Democrats actually get out in front on the issue, right? That is, the more that Republicans are perceived of as having come to this position for their own reasons, as opposed to moderating or coming to the Democrats, the more that this is perceived of as the conservative position rather than Republicans adopting the liberal position, the more that it's going to be identity appropriate. So in some ways, it's actually better for the Democrats to leave this to the Republicans and more or less just provide votes when they're needed, rather than to get too close and hold hands with Republicans and sing Kumbaya.
Yeah, which is in conflict with some of this identity stuff that you were talking about. I mean, that is to say, if Republicans were to go along with the Kumbaya singing, they wouldn't be the same party anymore. So, forgive me.
Right. I mean, the thing that allows some people to vouch for this as being the authentic position, right? Again, what all these right-wing crime guys are saying is, we had the wrong position before, right? In the sense that we had the non-conservative position, right? And again, if you look at Grover Norquist, he's been giving these really remarkable speeches where he says that prisons are no different than the welfare office, or the schools that we attack as being big government scams, and so we had the wrong position before. Our position was insufficiently conservative, and now we're being consistent, right? Well, he can only do that work. He can only get people to think that that's the actual conservative position, so long as he's perceived of as really a rock-ribbed, all the way down conservative, and he's going to lose that if he's actually seen as cozying up too much with Democrats. So the fact that Norquist is the guy that everybody knows says he wants to get government small enough to to strangle it or drown in the bathtub, that's what makes people think, oh, if he's saying it, then this is really is the conservative position. And again, I think that gets to the point of, there's a lot of indeterminacy about what people think the liberal position on something or the conservative position. Again, going back to the late 60s or early 70s, you would have thought being pro-life was the liberal or democratic position. And I think, and that obviously changed. And I think we're in the process of seeing this position taking on prisons changing even as we speak.
Okay, so this analysis is interesting. What comes of this? I mean, having observed the process of policy change being impeded and guided along the political psychological lines that you've been describing, what implications do you draw going forward?
Well, again, I think one important implication is this comes from this point about selective information processing, right? Which is that the old position was anchored by the fact that people kept ignoring information that was identity inappropriate. Well, if you suddenly change people's perception of what the identity appropriate position is, then you can have a real strong tipping point kind of phenomenon where suddenly all kinds of information that people were ignoring starts being paid attention to, and therefore all kinds of positions that they held before suddenly get destabilized. And so I think that's where there's a real process, a very rapid change in legislation that's possible. And I think you see that, and I think that's encouraged by the fact that states have budget problems, right? I mean, and one of the things we push in the article is that the budget problem states are facing is part of this, right? At least but in some cases it's the opposite of what you think, right? Texas made their really big moves in rethinking what their prison position was when they had a state budget surplus, right? And the issue there was, well, are we going to use all this state budget surplus to just go down a rat hole of building a whole bunch of new prisons, or are we going to have it available for tax cuts or other things that Republicans like? Now, we've obviously had the flip side in states that have deficits where the issue is, do we raise taxes or do we pull back on our prisons? So I think certainly those budget issues have mattered a lot. But I think the basic implication of this is that there's a huge opportunity for change here. And it's remarkable to see how quickly some state legislators are changing. If you look in Florida recently, the head of, I think it's the Florida House Judiciary Committee, has been pushing, again, in Florida, which is a very big incarcerator, has been pushing for change using, again, almost the exact carbon copy language that conservatives and right-on-crime people have been using in other states. And again, I think that also points to how important policy entrepreneurship is here, right? That you have these state conservative think tanks who can kind of diffuse these ideas, who can diffuse a kind of language that to various different places, and those things can happen really quickly as soon as people sort of get the message that they were using the wrong language, they had the wrong idea before, and here's the new one. And again, especially where you get people who are well situated institutionally to change, as you have in Florida, as you had in Texas, as you have in a bunch of other states. One of the predictions is that I even think people like you have been saying that that it was only going to take a huge social movement or a kind of social revolution to change some of this. It actually turns out that a lot of this change is coming in a completely different way than I think a lot of people thought it would. And again, I think if the more conservatives continue to sort of move down this direction, the more you're going to see change, and you may actually see change faster in conservative states than you might in liberal states, like California.
That's an interesting prediction, Steve. And
so that's the prediction.
And this is the reason why I'm sitting at your feet here in Political Science 101, so that I won't make foolish statements like the one that I made. But let me ask you this: I mean, where are liberals in all of this? It sounds like, and where is moral argument? You know, I mean, this is my reflex. My reflex is to say, what we've done in this area of policy is just, reprehensible. It's just inconsistent with our deeper values and so forth. Is that, that makes me a Pollyanna, because I'll call attention to, I mean, you mentioned Florida. So Florida has a couple hundred people who committed crimes before the age of 18, incarcerated for life without the possibility of parole, a punishment that's administered in almost no other jurisdiction outside the United States on the planet. And some of us just want to cry out and say, oh, man, what an abomination. Look at who we are as a people and how it's expressed. And it sounds, as I listen to you, that there really is no place in a coherent policy reform strategy for that kind of Jeremiah.
I mean, again, in some ways, this is the same argument I feel like we've had for the last 15 years. Is about how valuable is Jeremiah, and I think there are certain areas where, in terms of people keeping this issue alive while we were waiting around for conservatives to change their mind, I think it certainly was important. But in some ways, I think we're past that period now. We're past the period in which people need to make Jeremiah. So I think in some ways, I mean, people are already there, and the interesting thing is, again, though, that there are conservatives who are making moral arguments on this, but they're making moral arguments using their own indigenous language of morality. Again, I think you've seen, even we quote from a guy named Tim Dunn, who's a very rock-ribbed Christian conservative who got onto this issue by listening to Chuck Colson. Now, Chuck Colson was capable of giving, Jeremiah himself, but it was a different kind of Jeremiah than at least you're making now. And I think that moral argument that, again, there are conservatives who are saying that, these people are, these are creatures of God, right? They're fallen, they've done terrible things, but that we should treat them like human beings. I think that's a kind of moral argument that that conservatives, in some sense, drawing on their pro-life beliefs, have used.
No, that's right.
So I think that kind of moral argument is valuable.
Chuck Colson's Prison Fellowship Ministries on the board for a number of years back in the 90s. And, what you characterize about the inner logic of that movement, this is Prison Fellowship Ministries, is absolutely correct. And the kind of metaphor was, the crucifixion, there's Christ, and next to him on a cross is a thief who's being crucified, and Christ makes a place in heaven for the thief who is willing to confess and say the right things at the last moment. And this sort of notion of redemption is something that Chuck Colson and company held out as a model for the attitude to bring to this area of public policy.
Yeah, and in the article, we talk a lot about Colson and Pat Nolan, who was his guy in Washington on these issues.
Yeah.
And the other thing I think turns out to be really very important that a number of people mentioned us when we were doing the research for this article is how important it is that evangelicals are actually going into prisons now, right? All that prison ministry means that there's a huge number now of very conservative evangelical people, right? Not just a bunch of guys in Washington, but ordinary people who are going there, who are actually seeing prisons, right? Who are actually seeing how, in many cases, dehumanizing they are. They're going back to their congregations and telling their congregations about this. And so that's a very different kind of process than you see in some kind of issues where there's like a liberal group and they go and they try and find some guy with a collar to come and present, to provide the conservative side of the, the issue. Right? This is something that actually has a deep indigenous base within very conservative people. I think that's another reason why I think there's a reason to believe that you're going to see more and more of this, right? Because there actually is a real grassroots base, not a grassroots in the way that people in Washington talk about it, but actual people back in their communities who are talking about this, who are saying, people I was ministering to, right, in the prisons were being mistreated, right, and mistreated by government, right, and we ought to do something about that.
No,
so I think that also is another, right, so.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Steve. I think that's really very informative, and I wish we could have had more time to talk, but we have a crowded agenda and limited time, so why don't we move on to the second half of the political science lecture this morning.
Okay, or sermon or whatever you want to
talk
call
a little bit about complexity in policy making and policy administration and the welfare state and such, as you explore in this other piece of yours that I found so interesting. Kludgeocracy.
Kludgeocracy, yeah. So the as in Washington kind of things, it's more important to have a neologism in some cases than to have an actual idea. Hopefully, this is a neologism.
a memorable
that is
neologism,
actually,
yes.
Hopefully, this is a neologism that's actually connected to an underlying idea. So I had this paper. I should say when I used to be a fellow at the New America Foundation, and when I was there, we often had conversations around with the other fellows, people like Raihan Salam, who you know very well.
I do.
And I was at one of these discussions, and I said, there's this whole dimension, especially in the left-right dimension, we're always talking about the size and scope of government, right? But there's this other dimension that in some sense cuts right through that standard left-right dimension, which is about how complicated government is, right? Again, I say in the paper, if you look at U.S. public policy, almost any issue, if you were going to try and find the most opaque, complicated, multi-jointed way of solving a problem, you couldn't do much better than what we're already doing. And so that's where the idea of thinking about this as a kind of kludge came from. And a kludge in computer programming is a kind of patch that you put on a program in order to solve a particular problem you have without having to go and sort of pull the whole thing apart and build it back over again.
Yeah.
And that's fine. And in some cases, those are very elegant. But when you have a computer program that has too many kludges, right, that has too many of those patches, eventually you get something that doesn't work very well. In the paper, I say, that's pretty much a good description of Windows. So I say typing on an Apple.
You are a Mac user, yes, I can tell.
I am a Mac user, yeah. So the interesting thing there is to say, well, what does that metaphor tell us about American government? Well, in part, we have a system that makes it very hard to do really comprehensive change. And therefore, the path of least resistance in many cases is to create a patch, to layer something on top of what we've already got, rather than to go and change all of what we've already got to build something simpler. And that, again, is fine. That's incrementalism. We were often told how awesome incrementalism was back when I was in grad school. But you do enough incrementalism and you build a system that has absolutely no coherence and often imposes very large costs, right? I mean, the Obamacare is a good example of this. Again, I supported the bill, as I know very grudgingly you did. But that is a massive kludge, right? We basically built this system to try and get universal health care. We took the existing Medicaid system and we kind of pumped it full of helium.
Yep.
And we took the existing private insurance system and we tried to sort of pump that up and squeeze it into into these exchanges, and when we sort of link that together with our employer system, right, and then we put a bunch of subsidies and IPAB and all those other things together. So we took a whole lot of the pieces we already had and then tried to squeeze them together or pump as much as we could out of them until we actually got something like universal care. And that's, and again, I supported it, right? That was the best we could get at the time. But it's a policy that's going to have all kinds of consequences, especially where the joints of those different pieces end up meeting up, right? Where the employer system and the exchanges meet up and Medicaid meet up and all those things are inherent in any of these kind of layered over systems.
So as you described this, excuse me for interrupting. I mean, it seems to me that it's ideally designed to lead to many unintended consequences that will only be discovered after the fact, and B, it's very non-transparent, so that it's difficult for an observer on the outside to figure out what's really going on and who's responsible for what.
Right. So again, the costs of kludges like this, and I go into some other ones in the paper, but the cost one I think is a political cost, which you make reference to, and I think that political cost has two sides. Right. One is there's two sides with transparency. Right. One is for the people who actually are benefiting. They're not necessarily likely to know that they're benefiting, right, or at least know that it really was government that was doing it. Again, this is true whether you think of the way we finance higher education, where if you do polls of students, huge number of them don't recognize the way the subsidies they're getting is really coming from government, right? They think that was their parents saving, even though their parents are giving massive subsidies for doing that, right? So one side is arguably the American public ought to be more supportive of government, but it's getting all of its support in these transparent ways, non-transparent ways that end up making them think that they're actually doing it all themselves or they're getting it through the market. And on the other side, I think of lack of transparency is when things don't go right, that responsibility also doesn't process back to the people who pass the law either, right? There's all these different chains in the link of policy between the final outcome and the person who voted for whatever law it was. So when things don't go well, we often don't, really blame who ought to be blamed. And the consequence of that, I think, is rather than, throwing out the bums who actually pass the undesirable policy, is you get a generic loss of trust in government overall, right? People simply say, well, we can't make any of these linkages. We can't figure out who was responsible. So it's government that's the problem overall. I think that explains one of the reasons why trust in government overall is so low. It's because it's hard to actually be really discreet in your lack of trust. So you have a kind of diffuse lack of trust.
But hold on a minute. Now, I mean, we just had a presidential campaign. The Republican who was roundly defeated ran from coming out of the gate to his very last step saying that he was going to repeal Obamacare on his very first day of office. And likewise, the president ran, if not as forthrightly, nevertheless, on the idea that this was a historic development in the evolution of American social policy, which no one had been able to get done before, and for which he was due credit. So I'm not sure I'm following the point that you're making right now. If we take the clutch-heavy healthcare Affordable Care Act example about accountability and responsibility, since clearly the Republicans left no doubt that they were again this huge expansion of federal bureaucracy, and the Democrats are very forthright in taking credit for their, quote, accomplishment.
Well, I mean, the important thing to know about the healthcare law is almost none of it's actually gone into effect yet, right? It's really just, I mean, the real issue is about when either, new programs and new services start being delivered to you, do you recognize them as government, right? And most of those aren't actually, affecting anybody yet. And also, again, when the bad things happen, who gets blamed for them?
Yeah.
Right? And so ideally, if you're actually receiving a benefit that you value and you think was useful, right, you'd want to go to the people who made that happen and say, gee, thanks, right, here's a vote for you, right? And again, if things go badly, you'd want to go back to the people who made the thing happen and say, screw you, I'm voting against you, right? But all that complexity makes that hard after policies are already in place. It sort of breaks that feedback mechanism that should be connecting policy outcomes and electoral kind of consequences.
Okay. So
yeah,
go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask, in the concrete policy areas of Medicaid, a program administered by the states with federal funds being transferred to help underwrite its costs, and public education, primary and secondary education, a program, a set of policies that are based at the state level, but in which the federal government is extremely active with all manner of conditional federal aid. How does the complexity problem that you're describing in general play out in those areas of policy, and what reforms do you imagine might be feasible that would make a real difference in terms of streamlining, simplifying, increasing efficiency, and also making the political lines of responsibility more transparent?
Right. I mean, again, if you think about education, the important thing to know about, and again, this is actually true about a lot of what the federal government does, right? A huge amount of what the federal government does, other than the Defense Department, right, is it basically hands over money to states and it gives them lots of conditions in exchange for doing that, right? That's true of education. That's true of Medicaid, right? The federal government doesn't run Medicaid. States run Medicaid, but it hands them money and gives them conditions. But again, in education, I think the interesting point is that there's a lot of research out there that shows that all of those federal programs that have all those rules end up creating a real strong compliance mentality in schools, right? So you have all these little individual pots of money that have all these individual rules, and just making sure that you're staying in compliance with all those federal programs is a huge undertaking, and that's actually a lot of what school districts actually do, right? School districts or states are actually spending lots of their time actually doing compliance. Well, there's a fixed amount of attention out there, right? And all that attention you're putting into compliance with all these federal rules is attention that you're not putting toward innovation, toward thinking about doing things in new ways. And in fact, anytime you do think about innovation, the first thing you're going to have to say is, well, if we do this really radically new thing, how is that going to change, or how is that going to interact with all these rules that we have to deal with, right? So again, my general preference is for what Mike Grieva called, one policy, one government, right? With Medicaid, what I would prefer would be basically to scrap Medicaid entirely, to either completely federalize Medicaid, or to basically put all everybody who's in poverty who's in Medicaid now into these exchanges, or to merge Medicaid and Medicare, right? Any of those would be better than the sort of jerry-rigged state-federal system that we have now. The same thing would be true of education. Again, ideally, I'm a kind of soft voucher supporter, so I actually would prefer if we scrapped the entire property tax-based way of funding schools and went to, right, I mean, that would be a good example of a non-kludgy way to operate.
But now, hold on. I just want to, excuse me for interrupting again, but I just want to ask, I mean, block granting federal aid, for example, in the case of Medicaid, block granting it and just having it be not a lot of strings, just the dollars coming, just a pure fiscal thing. Let the states take care of their poor. I believe that was one of the slogans of the Republican candidate. Send the money back to the states and let the feds get out of the way. Isn't that a conservative step in the direction that you're advocating?
Well, again, not necessarily. I mean, again, ideally, you would want to have 100% financing at the point of administration. Right. So again, either the states are going to be funding this out of their own money, or the feds are going to be funding it and running it out of their own money. Once you have this division where they're funding it in part and the states are funding it in part, again, it also is easy to keep pointing fingers at who's responsible. The feds can point fingers at the states. The states can. I think it actually focuses people's minds a lot to actually.
I'm sorry, but how do I do interstate fiscal transfers from regions of the country that are prosperous to regions of the country that are less so, without federal involvement, even if I want the program to be run at the level of the state?
Well, again, I think that's partially what I'm trying to actually get away from. I think that having transfers from the federal government to individuals and states is one thing, right? So Social Security does plenty of that, right? Social Security is a massive redistribution from the federal government to individuals and states. Right. But that's different than the federal government transferring resources to other governments. Right? And that's what I'm trying to. Right. So my preferred alternative with vouchers, right, would probably end up being a massive transfer of resources to under-resourced individuals in states, and therefore to states. To states overall. But that's a very different thing than actually basically funding states. So what I'd like to have is to reduce the number of general welfare state functions that states are doing, and then let them compete on everything else, right? They say, let's let it rip. If they want to compete on everything else other than the big social insurance things that really ought to be done at the federal government level, right? They want to compete on economic development. They want to compete on regulation above some point, right? Let them do all that. If the federal government isn't willing to actually take responsibility for something wholly and therefore also take accountability for it, then it ought to let states do it. But what I really want to do is unweave these connections we built between the federal government and states that are problematic both from, I think, accountability and, I think, create the possibility of real implementation problems. In some sense, Katrina, I argue in the paper, was a huge example of the problems of kludgeocracy, right? From the design of the levees, which was this complicated relationship between the Corps of Engineers in Louisiana. All the emergency response was, had to have the federal government and states have to coordinate themselves. All of that is a result of trying to actually have not really make the hard choice between making this a federal or a state function.
So one of the arguments on behalf of federalism that you hear is we don't want to race to the bottom. That is, if the states were competing openly with respect to, for example, formulating their aid policies to poor people, there'd be an incentive for each state to beggar its neighbor, have less generous policy in the hope that, people will move across state line or whatever it might be, or to attract business interests, the fear that each state will sort of outbid the other in terms of tax incentives and so forth, so that you locate in Georgia and not in Alabama, you locate in Massachusetts and not in New Hampshire, and that by federalizing or bringing the federal government into the policy picture, you can mitigate these race to the bottom problems. What do you say about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's true. And again, if you think that race to the bottom problem is big enough, right, the way to solve it is to nationalize the thing entirely, right? Again, there's no reason why. I mean, there's no efficiency gain for having states run health insurance. I don't think any economist would actually say there's a good argument for why states actually are better at doing that, right? I mean, all these, again, and the important thing to remember is we can come up with post hoc rationalizations for why maybe it will be a good idea to have, this for efficiency reasons, but none of these policies, or almost none of them, actually exist for that reason, right? Most of these state federal things exist because for a long time the South had a veto on national social insurance. It said, look, it's fine, we'll have these programs, right? But only if we get to run them, right? And that's the general design we have now.
I was just going to interject, as Ira Katznelson reminds us in his When Affirmative Action Was White, his book, one of the reasons, at least in the early years of the federal welfare state, that the Southern interest insisted on local administration of programs was that they were concerned about the effect those programs might have on race relations and empowering African Americans in their jurisdictions. They wanted to be able to keep their hands over the local administration of the programs to mitigate that effect.
Yeah, I mean that's the reason why our social welfare state actually has such a large role for the states, right? And again, part of this is that point about the way kludges work, right? Once we've already got something like that, then the incentive is to build on it rather than to redo it, right? So a lot of subsequent, policy we made isn't because, southern states still want to, have the ability to, discriminate against African Americans. In some cases it is, right? But it's mainly because it's the path of least resistance to build on the policy that was designed originally for that purpose, right? So speaking of which, I think we've backed into our last topic.
Yeah, well, let's do, because we're running out of time. So let's have Django Unchained. the film Quentin Tarantino, Jamie Foxx stars. Everybody's heard about the film, and I had the temerity to recommend to viewers of the Glenn Show that they might go see the film. And I gather that you think less of it than I did, and why don't you tell us why?
Well, I don't know that I would say that. I think my feelings on the movie, I mean, in some ways, I think it's a very impressive movie. I'd be interested in hearing what you said, but the first thing that strikes me, having seen all the Tarantino movies and being sort of the same generation as him, right, is like all this, the movie is basically about the movies, right? All of his movies are basically movies about movies, right? And they're movies about movies that also have something else going on. And people often describe this as a revenge movie, right? And obviously it's a revenge movie in the sense that you have a slave who gets freed and he ends up going back to get his wife and also take revenge on the guy who now owns her. But it's also Tarantino's revenge on the movies themselves, right? It's a revenge on all these genres of movies, right? Westerns, by Gone with the Wind, and all these other ones that had Hollywood's really extraordinary implication in American racism, right? And the diffusion of a lot of the basic tropes of American racism. And so I think part of the way to read this movie is it's his way of getting back at all those other movies, right?
Again, let me interject, because I think that that's an astute observation. And the reason I think it's an astute observation is that my son, Glenn Loury II, who on occasion can be seen on the Glenn Show, who's a huge movie buff, gave precisely that reading. He says, Dad, you can't understand Django Unchained unless you understand that Tarantino is dealing with his reaction to films that have been being made about the West and about race since the 1930s. So it's a kind of inside, there's a lot of quotes, and he even goes into the cinematography of it. He says, do you see this shot? Do you see that shot? That's just like what happened in The Searchers, or that's just like what, John Huston did in this, or what Sergio Leone did in that, and so forth and so on. As it turns out, Quentin Tarantino and Sergio Leone were born on the same day, my son informs me, and you can't understand Tarantino without knowing that.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously I think a lot of the criticisms that were made of this movie were criticisms that weren't really sufficiently, I think, sophisticated about the fact that he's also making a genre movie here, right? Yeah. That is, he's working within the spaghetti western kind of genre, and there's only certain kind of things that your protagonist can do in that genre, right? So I've heard some people saying, the Jamie Foxx character is insufficiently sort of sympathetic to other African Americans. I don't think that's always true, right? There's a big scene near the middle at what Big Daddy's plantation, where he takes revenge against these people who are whipping a slave, right? And I think at the end, right, he takes revenge for this slave who is chewed apart by dogs, right? But still, I mean, the basic point of this movie of the spaghetti western is the protagonist or anti-hero, whatever you call it, is profoundly individualistic, right?
Indeed.
He's not part of the group, right? He's the loner. He's the guy who's out for himself, right?
No, I think you're right on that. See, I mean, I have heard this criticism that the Jamie Foxx character has no politics. He has no solidarity with the slaves. And I kept thinking, well, the Jamie Foxx figure is a little bit like the Clint Eastwood figure in A Fistful of Dollars or A Few Dollars More or whatever. He's the guy that rides into town, somehow mysterious. Nobody really knows who he is. He's an outsider. He has a moral compass, to be sure, but it's of his own design. And he ain't about to lead a revolution. He's going to ride out of town on his own at the end of the movie, and you know it.
Right. And again, that's where I think if there's a problem with the movie, again, not every movie can be everything, right? And if there's a problem with the movie, it's about how much you can really make a profound movie about slavery while also making a genre movie that's this particular genre, right? A movie about slavery is going to have a little bit of a hard time also squeezing into the spaghetti western model that he's trying to do. But I actually think in some ways the most interesting thing about the movie is what it actually says about the impact of slavery on whites. And I think in some sense what it's best at doing is showing just how deeply morally corrupting
indeed.
Slavery was. And again, those scenes of where they're watching the Mandingo fighters, basically beat themselves to death. The sort of, corruption of the Southern aristocracy. I thought the movie actually was great at that. And again, it undermining all of the kind of images that that supposedly, that they're all the gentility of Southern aristocratic society. I think it was wonderful at undermining all of those. And so I think in that sense, that was actually a real strength of the movie, and certainly also something that was playing against this whole sort of tradition of trying to sort of play out how genteel the Old South was. So what did you think of it?
I was intrigued by the movie. I was very stimulated by it, and I was impressed by the ambition of the effort. I mean, I'm not as literate cinematically literate to have, except with the guidance of my son, placed it and Tarantino's, movie-making style in the right context. I wouldn't have done that without assistance from the outside. But I had the sense that I was watching something that was really bold and daring in what it was trying to do. And I did pick up on some of the stuff. I mean, like, for example, exposing the deep moral corruption attendant to having this kind of absolute power over other human beings. I think that is very well conveyed. I thought, here's a guy that's going to try to make a movie about this. I mean, I was just kind of stunned at the audacity of the whole thing. Recognized that it's a extremely difficult task to do, and even if he doesn't do it perfectly, I came out of the theater thinking that he hadn't done a bad job at it, and I was grateful for the attempt.
Right, and I think the other thing to say about it is, I guess my ambivalence is that sometimes the part where they're really quite explicitly showing what slavery involves, right? Not stripping away all of the pretense about it. Sometimes there's still some of that sort of Tarantino kind of winking that is a little, maybe again, I'm just saying my ambivalence is the best way to put it, right? I'm not entirely sure that that's the way I would have done it. The thing that also it made me think about, I was talking to some people about it, is obviously in part what this movie is responding to is Birth of the Nation, and that great scene in the movie where they have the guys on horseback with the hoods, and then they're all complaining they can't see through the hoods.
That was really funny.
I thought that was an absolutely brilliant scene. But one thing it reminds you of is the movie at least I don't know if anyone has really made a great movie. Is a great movie about Reconstruction, made from the pro-Reconstruction side. And I was thinking about this when I was at the National Portrait Gallery. They have a great exhibit that I took my 17-month-old son, who had no idea what the hell was going on. But I took him to this
exhibit.
You got
started early, though.
I have him every Monday. So we live in D.C., so the best thing to do is to go out to museums together, even if he doesn't know what's going on. So I took him to this, to this exhibit, and they have all these pictures of Civil War generals, and I took him in front of Sherman, and I said, son, this guy here, he's the one who saved the Union. General Sherman, he's the one who saved the Union, right? And one thing that points to is, again, in the history of America that we know through cinema, is there's no great movie basically on the tragedy that was Reconstruction. We have movies now. I mean, Django was about slavery, but not about what happened when actually the United States government, devoted huge amounts of blood to actually eliminate slavery, and how much of that got clawed back. It seems like that would be an incredible subject for the movies. But again, the great American Reconstruction movie is still Birth of the Nation, which was kind of extraordinary.
Well, it's not over yet. Maybe Spike Lee will step up.
Maybe your son will step up. Quentin Tarantino started out working in the video store.
You, man. I think we're out of time now. So
all right, good talking to you too, Glenn.
And have another conversation after a while.
All right, talk to you soon.
All right, Steve. Thanks a lot.
All right, bye.